Well, good afternoon. I'm enough.
Always raise it too.
Good afternoon. Good to see so many of you here. And I'm going to turn this way so I can see a little bit of the screen. So, tell me first of all, what's our time frame for this talk?
Between 45 minutes and an hour.
Perfect. Okay. So what I'll try to do is keep it to around 45 minutes and have time for some Q&A. Usually when I'm talking about this subject, there's a lot of questions. I'm going to take you through quite a few slides. So there's a lot of information that we know now about the problem of social connection and the challenges we have making social connections in ways that really make our communities better. And so that's what we're going to talk about. And what I'm going to emphasize over and over as kind of the theme of this talk is that this is something that we have to do individually with one another to improve our communities. And we'll talk a little bit about how to do that. So this book I came out with, it comes out of work I've been doing probably for about 15 years at Viterbo as part of our Masters in Servant Leadership program. I've been teaching a course called Building Community and discovered some work that was done by a sociologist named Ray Oldenburg back in the 1980s about third places. If you think of your home as first place, work as second place, third place is where you go to socialize. This is where we make friendships, where we both form and nurture our friendships. And it turns out they're really vital to communities in a number of ways that we kind of have taken for granted for a long time. So I want to show you why that's so important. But I want to start out with this question. And this question is like, do you think the world is getting better or worse? And one way to ask that question is, like, is it better or worse than it was 60 years ago? So what do you think? How many of you think the world is better today than 60 years ago? So how many of you think the world is worse overall? So, okay, so we have some of each. Well, here's what we find when we, I guess I took out the slide that showed the results. If we do surveys like all over the world, it turns out Americans, about 6% of Americans think the world is getting better. That's a really low percentage. And it's only in Indonesia and China where the numbers even approach 50% of people that think the world is getting better. It's in countries where people have actually seen considerable progress in their lifetimes. But otherwise, and especially in the most developed nations, that's where people are most pessimistic about the world. And I want to show you like how unwarranted that view is. If we look at just a few statistics, and I'm taking some slides here from a website called Our World in Data, which kind of compiles all kinds of studies of significant questions about what's going on in the world. One of them is about extreme poverty. So if you look at the number of people in extreme poverty, what we find if we look back in history, for probably all of the world's history, up until the 1800s, around 90-95% of the people in the world lived in extreme poverty. That is, they didn't know where their next meal was coming from. And if we just look back to 1950, we find that even 1950, about 75% of the world lived in extreme poverty. And if you look at the progress we've made, so the progress we made in our lifetime around the world is really considerable. Of course, as a fairly developed nation, we didn't see that much progress here, but some of you remember the old UNICEF commercials with children with the distended bellies because there was famine and the appeals for famine relief. Now the only places where we have children who are starving are in places of ongoing conflict where food supplies can't be delivered to them. But otherwise, this is a remarkable thing that we've pretty much eliminated famine from the world. If we look at global child mortality, when we do archaeological studies, we find that pretty much 40 to 50% of children died before the age of 5 in just about every civilization that's been studied. prior to industrialization. But then after industrialization, we get a number of things happening. One is improvements in agriculture. But the other thing that happens is we get improvements in governments, we get more democracies, and we get the ability of institutions to do research and find out what are the major health problems and the problems that are affecting safety. And so we do research, we educate more people, we're expanding literacy, and what happens is with both economic improvement and educational improvement and better forms of government, we've really reduced global child mortality. And so what we find is that since the late 1800s, early 1900s, we've been improving life expectancy, and we've been doing that regularly. And yet we don't tell that news very well. So some of you might remember in 2021, there were headlines saying life expectancy drops for the first time in 100 years. And it was like, this is really bad news. The good news, of course, is life expectancy had been increasing steadily for 100 years. And then in 2022, it resumes increasing again. I mean, it's pretty remarkable, the age that we're living in. Oh, here's the slide. I just forgot where I had it, of people who think the world is getting better. But look at the countries that are most pessimistic: USA, Singapore, Great Britain, Germany, Australia, France. These are countries where living conditions are fairly good. And so this is why I think people are so pessimistic. We've been studying anxiety since 1990 around the world, and we find ever since we started studying it, it's been increasing. And it's not just anxiety, it's anxiety, stress, and depression have all been increasing regularly. And we didn't even start studying this until around 1990, right about that time. The word burnout gets invented in 1988. Hello, David. You just missed my part about all the good news. I'm into the bad news now, so join us for the bad news. The world has been getting better, but we're feeling worse about it. And anxiety, the rise in anxiety is a big reason. If we look at trust, we find, you've probably seen these studies of looking at how trust is being lost in institutions. And so like people are losing trust in government, in banks, in churches, military, kind of all of our institutions. But this is what I find is even more interesting, just asking if people in general can be trusted. And that's declining significantly. So if we look at, like in 1972, close to 50% of people thought that most people can be trusted, to we're down closer to 20% today. This only goes up to 2014. And we've had considerable drop since that time. In fact, the latest survey I've said that the only category, when you ask like of different categories of people, who can you trust? The only category that reaches 50% is myself. That's not good, and partly because you are the last person you should trust. Like you should your friends are going to be more honest with you than you will be. And here's the most disturbing study I've seen in the last couple of years. This came out fairly recently, and it's a study looking at historical language use and evidence of cognitive distortion. So these are words and phrases that are indicative of irrational ways of thinking. And they're types of thinking that are characteristic of people that are in depression. And so there's things like catastrophizing, like thinking that whatever happens, this is the worst possible thing. Or black and white thinking, or why does something always happen to me, this extreme personalization, those sorts of patterns of thinking. And the last time we saw an sharp increase in cognitive distortion was in Germany right after World War II. But since 2020, we're seeing it all over the world. We're seeing this rise in the use of cognitive distortions. And the researchers of this particular study say it really looks like the entire world is in a collective depression. And so here we are in this situation where, in some respects, there's never been a better time to be a human being on the planet because of economic growth, improvements in health and safety and environmental conditions. We have, like, everything we study, we're getting better at, except how we feel and how we feel especially about one another. And so the question is why? Why is our subjective feeling getting so much worse while objective conditions are improving? And there's a lot of speculation. This is my attempt at an answer here. And I think it has to do with friendship. I think it has to do with our personal connections to one another. And there's been a lot of speculation. Some of you know about there's been a lot of talk about the loneliness epidemic. The Surgeon General Vivek Murthy came out with a report on this. There's been a lot of writing about it, especially since the pandemic. And many people are attributing the increase in loneliness and like social disconnection, some to the pandemic, some to smartphones and social media. I think there's a lot to that. I'm going to show you some indication that that has a lot to do with it. But it's deeper than that. But it's hard to find because as I said, we weren't doing a lot of studies that we can go back and look at, like, well, what was friendship like before, other than anecdotal information. But then I thought about the Google Ngram. So Google has been digitizing the world's library for a number of years. And as part of that project, you can go on something called the Google Ngram, and you can do word searches, and you can compare the relative frequency of how different words are used. So I just compared self and friend over the past 200 years. And here's what we get. Let's see. If you look at 1820, the word self, which is represented in the blue, is used about one half to 1/3 is oftentimes as the word friend, which is in red. Around 1910, the word self and the word friend are used with about the same frequency. And today, the word self is used twice as much as the word friend. And so we see these two trajectories, and it's not as if either self or friend have acquired radically new uses that would explain why they change. I think it's that we're becoming more individualistic, and we're becoming gradually more individualistic for 200 years. But what has happened in the last 200 years? Well, it's industrialization that's happened. And if we think about how does technology affect our lives and affect our relationships? Well, one thing most technologies do is they improve our lives in some objective manner, because every new technology, every form of technology that lasts because it serves some purpose. It enables us to do something, to give us some kind of power or ability we didn't have before. And either it gives us a new power, a new ability, or it gives us more convenience or more freedom, the ability to do something like on our time or on our schedule. So these two things, power and freedom. And what power and freedom do together is they make us less interdependent, right? And so as we see technology increasing, we see individualism increasing also. And then if we think about, well, what is the pattern of technology growth? What we see is that as a species, we've been developing new technologies for a long time, but hundreds of years ago, they were further spread apart. Like the really groundbreaking, radically new and like extensively applied technologies came in infrequent bursts. So if you get something like in 1440, we get the invention of the printing press. You don't get another new kind of game-changing technology like that for a long time. But it also takes a long time for it to affect people's daily lives. So you get something like the printing press, and then Leonardo da Vinci in the following century. The printing press really, even a century later, isn't affecting how Leonardo da Vinci lives. And yet newer technologies, we get them coming along now, and they affect us pretty profoundly fairly quickly. And so we're getting more technologies, and then we're getting them affecting our lives at an increasing pace. So let me give you an example of this. So ChatGPT 3 gets released 2 years ago, this fall, pretty much 2 years ago now. I think it was in November of 2022. 2 weeks later, I get a paper written by a student by AI.
Oh my God.
2 weeks,
Wow.
right? It's like the speed of implementation. But what does that require? So I get a paper that's written by AI. We don't have policies at our university because it's not plagiarism. It wasn't copying somebody else's work, right? It's an original creation. We don't have policies for it. So now we have to create new policies. We have to implement them in the classrooms. We have to have these discussions. We have to change the way we're teaching and grading, right? See, every new radical technology changes the way in which we interact with one another as well. And here's the thing about our human beings, our brains aren't really changing. So we're still, here we are in Viroqua, living with pretty much the same brains as the ancestors who lived here centuries ago, yeah? But we're living in a radically different world, okay? So even though we have to live with one another and with the natural world in very different ways, we're still living with brains that are suited more for living in an oak savanna with natural threats and like predators that we're afraid of. And so, like, people are still afraid of snakes and spiders, right? How many of you are afraid of snakes or spiders? Now, how many of you know somebody who's been killed by a snake or spider? Like, every once in a while I get somebody who does, but right? But we sell donuts. Like, people go in donut stores and they buy them, right? They don't run away, and there's a lot more people killed by donuts than by snakes. And so we've created this artificial world in which our brain is drawn towards things that we should be afraid of, and we're repelled by things that aren't harmful at all because we're living in such an artificial world that's been created by the development of new technologies. Yeah. And it's not just that the world is not natural to us. It's like this causes all kinds of anxieties because we have to continually be adjusting our mode of living in ways that aren't natural to us in some deep sense, that we become accustomed to, but require a continual readjustment of the ways in which we live. And I'll come back to this in a little bit, but I want to show you like what's happening is the way in which the world is changing very rapidly and quite deeply, especially in terms of our interpersonal relationships. There's a reason it's causing such high rates of anxiety, stress, and depression, because we've been for quite a while changing a lot of things about the physical world, but now our technology is changing things about our mental world as well in ways that our brain isn't well adapted to. And so this next few slides are going to come from Jonathan Haidt, who came out with a book earlier this year called The Anxious Generation. And he's been sharing a lot of his data now for about 10 years that he was working on collecting things for this book. And like how does social media and smartphones in general, how is that affecting us, and how is it affecting us generationally? And what we find is it affects like Gen Z and millennials much more than boomers or Gen Xers. So this is the study of anxiety, prevalence broken down by ages. And what you notice here is every generation has different anxiety levels. Of course, teen girls are going to have higher rates of anxiety because they're teen girls, right? That's always been that case. You have those generational differences. But you notice the sharp uptick beginning in 2012. 2012 was the first year that a majority of middle school kids had access to social media and their own smartphones. So this is a couple of years after Facebook lowers its age from 18 to 13, and then the iPhone gets introduced, and then pretty soon you have other companies coming out with other versions of smartphones. But 2012 then is this when it hits middle schools. Now you also find some effect in ages 26 to 34, but look at age 50 plus. No change. And the question has always been, well, why not? Well, because like, how many of you have smartphones? How many of you have a social media account? Right? Why aren't you affected by increasing anxiety in the same way that younger generations are? Well, this is part of the speculation. This is that when younger people at this age, it's a really important formative time in which you're forming your social identity in relationship with other people. And once that's been established, so once you have a friend network, you have your relationships already established, you use social media very differently, because what you use it for is for figuring out what's going on in your community or with your friends in order to enhance those connections. So like you might find out about an event going on at the library at 2:15 in the afternoon, December 11th, so you say you'll go, and then you end up having more social connection than you would if you didn't have something like that, because it expands your connection. But you're probably not using it to replace your social networks. And so generations that are using it to replace their social networks, and I'll show you why we know that younger people are using it that way, it's has very bad results on their mental well-being. The other thing is, when you think of like what happens to your sense of self when you form a friend network, one of the things that happens is you become socially networked, you become socially situated in a thick fashion. Like you have these really strong ties with others, and you kind of develop then a sense of who you are in relationship to others. When your social network is primarily mediated by an online presence, what happens is how you're socially situated is always in flux. Because depending on what you post or what others post about you, your self-opinion, your self-regard can go up and down wildly. And we see this happening in teens. Like, something happens, it's the worst thing ever, and another time it's the best day ever, and it goes up and down. Whereas in an actual friend network, when you sit down with a cup of coffee with a few friends, and you're talking about this fantastic thing that happened to you, one of your friends is going to say, oh, it's not that great, and they'll tell you about something that happened to them, and they'll kind of bring you down to a regular level. Or if you just had really bad news, they will lift you up. And so you get a kind of modulating of your emotions and your sense of self in these thick friend networks, and instead of an amplifying of the extremes that you get over social media. And this becomes really dangerous for young people. And so we find evidence. Look at the years that we get the increase in these major depressive episodes, worse for girls than for boys. Suicide, by the way, is much higher for boys than for girls, but the anxiety and depression is higher for girls. Undergraduate with a mental illness, and this isn't self-reports of anxiety or depression, this is diagnoses, and what we find is like for other kinds of underlying mental health conditions, we're not seeing an increase, but we're seeing increases in anxiety and depression. And then when we think about the ways in which these conditions are amplified by social media, if you use it to replace your your regular social network, so it isn't done to enhance those networks, but instead of them. And then we look at the amount of time. So right now, average hours on screens for 11 to 14-year-olds is 9 hours a day.
Wow.
And if you look at uses up to about 2 hours, doesn't seem to have much effect. So like 2 hours a day on screen time, and I would guess like most of you are probably not spending 9 hours a day. This is the other reason it's not affecting older generations as much, is because just of the time difference. This is a fascinating study of children's daily time use that was the result of a longitudinal study in Great Britain. And what we find is outdoor play and socializing outside of the home. So this is kind of unstructured play with friends or unstructured time with friends. Both have declined quite a bit. And yet screen-based activities, sport, and homework have all increased. Okay. So sport is interesting because it's definitely good for kids to participate in sporting activities, but it's also very structured activities where they don't have to work things out among themselves. You have adults that are kind of giving them the rules and supervising what they're doing. And it turns out that like friendship is formed much more in kind of unstructured social activities where kids are free to talk to one another and work things out among themselves. And this is what's declining. And so we see that huge decline of the amount of time that young people spend with friends. But here also look like what's happened since 2015, even among people like 45 years and older, it's gone from around 50 minutes a day to around 25 minutes a day. So even older generations are spending only about half as much time with friends as they were just 10 years ago. And if it weren't for, for ages 14 to 18 kind of falling off a cliff on a slide like this, if we took just that other generation, we'd say, that's really significant. Like we're spending half as much time. And then think of this, it's not just that you're spending less time with friends. You are probably spending less time just in casual interaction with strangers than you have at any other time. Because like going to the bank, talking to a teller, talking to a checkout clerk, I mean, wherever we go, more and more things are automated. You're doing more things online. When I buy a hunting license now, I don't go to the sports shop and go and talk to somebody while I'm buying a sporting license. I just go online and click some things. Like all these little transactions, we're not interacting with people as much. So the question is, what can we do about it? So this is Ray Oldenburg's work. This is where I found out about third places, and I think this has been transformational work. I started integrating these ideas of third places into my classes 15 years ago, and I found it was the thing that my students responded to most. And I would ask them to give a presentation on their third place, and they would find out some obviously they had a third place that they go to on a regular basis, and they love sharing about it. Their eyes would just light up. And I'd have other people that say, I don't have a third place. What do I talk about? And what I was finding over the course of the 15 years, more and more people, a higher percentage, would have no third place. So I'm noticing that generational shift. And this is also discussed in Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, which came out in 2000, where he talked about social capital. Social capital is the generalized trust that develops in communities when you have high levels of social engagement. And when you have high levels of social engagement, that happens because people are participating in activities together, like bowling leagues. So there are places in the country where they're building brand new bowling alleys. In fact, I was talking to somebody who recently just saw a brand new 50-lane bowling alley outside of Dallas. Went in there to talk to the manager at the bowling alley and found they have no leagues. 50 lanes, all kinds of people bowling, but not in leagues. And this is the thing, participation, church membership is declining, club membership, And it's declining for adults, and it's declining for youth. Okay. So things like 4-H and scouting and things like that really have dropped down. And so why is this important? Well, this is what Putnam documented in 2000 when he came out with his book, Bowling Alone. He said, if we looked at that time, we looked at states that were really high in social capital, at high rates of participating in clubs, of talking with neighbors and voting and volunteering, things like that. Those states high in social capital, children are doing much better. So the Kids Count Index is a well-known measure of children's well-being in communities. And if you look, you have a pretty strong correlation that's kind of, the states are aligned along an axis. And so if you look at, like up here in the upper right, Wisconsin, Minnesota, North Dakota, Vermont, these states, high social capital, high levels of social engagement compared to the rest of the U.S., and children are doing fairly well. If you look at states with really low social capital, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, kids are not doing well. And you have an even stronger correlation with educational outcomes. So states that have high social capital have really good educational outcomes. The schools are doing well, and kids are testing well. States with low social capital have really poor outcomes in education. Why is that? Well, if we look at studies looking at like student-teacher ratio or teacher pay or how they do testing or curriculum, all these things that we argue about politically about schools, none of those things have much of a correlation with actual student outcomes. The thing that matters is how involved are the parents. And if children are living in neighborhoods where parents are really highly engaged with the schools, but also with their neighbors and with other kinds of institutions, those kids do really well. Low parent involvement, kids are not doing as well. And here's crime. We argue about all the time politically about 3 strikes and you're out, or you know, how much we should jail people, capital punishment, all those things. They all make a difference, but none of it makes as much difference as the amount of social capital in a community. Highly engaged communities don't have as much crime. So this is really important. Now here's one more thing. The areas with really high social capital, which tends to be mostly in the Midwest and the Northeast, have a much higher rate of children being able to rise out of poverty. And so if we look at a longitudinal study of children being able to rise from the bottom fifth to the top fifth economically, we find in some of the southeastern states and some of the southwestern states where you have the lowest social capital, the rates of children rising out of poverty are around 4%. And if you look at places with higher social capital, you have anywhere from 20 to 35% rates of rising out of poverty. That's a huge difference. And since those studies have come out, we've looked even more particularly, and it's not just the state, it's even the neighborhood. When you have really highly engaged neighborhoods where people know their neighbors, children living in those neighborhoods are vastly more likely to be able to rise out of poverty. So this is really an intergenerational thing where we have fewer intergenerational kinds of activities and opportunities for people, but it turns out like it's really important for children for there to be these intergenerational relationships being developed. Yeah, you had a question in back.
From back here, I can't see what other
The darkest, that's like 35% rise. Now, I'll show you something in particular. In western North Dakota, you have some really dark green. So right here, that's right around Dickinson, North Dakota. And this is the study of, this is a study of what happened over the past 35 and 45 years. If we were looking right now, that would be entirely changed because of the Balkan oil fields. What's happened over the past 10 years is all kinds of young men have moved into those areas around Dickinson. And social capital has just dropped off because they don't have any ties. They don't have social ties, so they go out there for really high-paying jobs to make a lot of money, but not to be involved in the community. So much higher crime in western North Dakota and very little trust, right? So western North Dakota now is starting to look more like Las Vegas in terms of social capital, but it didn't historically. So here, this is what we see. So it's not, when we're looking at young people, what's really important, it's not just income level, it's economic connectedness. What happens when you have neighbors knowing one another and intergenerational connection, you also have friends of different economic levels knowing one another. And what we find, and then there's settings. So I want to show like the SES. So I'm getting a little bit technical and I'm going to run through this pretty quickly. So I'll just ask you to take my word for this. So, so what we find is it's easier to make friends in certain kinds of settings than other kinds of settings, put it that way. And so where we find more friends being made and more friends of different economic levels being made is in certain kinds of settings, and it's mostly what you see here in recreational groups and religious groups. Neighborhoods and colleges and high schools, not as much because you get a lot of kids like of the same income levels hanging out with one another, and also the schools, especially when you get in more urban areas, you have the wealthy schools and the poor schools, so forth. But you get much more mixing in recreational groups and religious groups. Now, I'm going to take you right into data. This comes from the Social Capital Atlas, and if you're really interested in this, I'd encourage you to Google this and go explore it. It's an interactive map, and you can go in and you can find all kinds of things. So this is Vernon County, and so what is the economic connectedness like in Vernon County? Well, 54% of friends are high income. This is how they kind of measure what is the economic connectedness. That's a pretty high rate. So like 54% of people in Vernon County know somebody who's high income. And if you look at like many other places in the country, it's going to be closer to like 30 to 40% because people are much more segregated by income levels into their neighborhoods. And so that's in the state, we are at the 92nd percent point of counties in Wisconsin. So there's greater economic connectedness in Vernon County than just about anywhere else in Wisconsin. And Wisconsin tends to be better than most other states. So this is some of the highest economic connectedness in the nation right here in Vernon County. That's a really good thing. What about friending bias? You have really low friending bias. That means it's easy for people to come into your community and get to know one another and get involved in groups. Okay? La Crosse, by contrast, has a really high friending bias. It's much harder to move into La Crosse and make friends if you're an outsider, right? So La Crosse has really high economic connectedness, very similar to Vernon County, but a really high friending bias, right? So once you're in the friend groups, you probably know friends of different income levels, but it's harder to get involved in groups because they're more cliquish. In Vernon County, it's easier to get involved and probably be invited in to join different groups.
Go for Oakland.
Go for Oakland. That's really.
What's a good thing?
What is the income when you talk high income?
I'm not, they look at percentiles, so percentiles nationally, and I think they do it by county. So what is the income range in the county and how many people at different levels know people at the 90th percentile? Yeah. Okay, so you're in good shape there. So how do you expand that? How do you do it? Well, it's probably because you have a lot of places for people to meet and interact in Vernon County compared to other places. Here's the thing is we're finding that this is declining just about everywhere in the country. So no matter kind of where you are, some places are really low with this, some are higher, like Vernon County, but wherever you are, it declines because we keep introducing new technologies that make it easier to be independent. And so the communities that are doing pretty well with both economic connectedness and friending bias are communities that are really deliberate about making sure that they have, that people get together on a regular basis. So there's probably a lot of events going on, a lot of clubs, a lot of organizations, and then a lot of places to gather. So those three things, right? Okay. And my argument is because historically human beings, we've had to gather together and collaborate in order to survive. We've always taken it for granted that, oh, of course we're going to get, that's just what we do. And our ancestors had to. When I talked to I remember hearing stories of my grandparents, like they depended on their neighbors all the time for when they were farming. They couldn't do it themselves. They had to interact, and there was all kinds of things that they did together. Now we can be pretty much independent if we want to be. And so the only way to get the social connection is to do it intentionally and deliberately. We have to plan it into our lives. And this is what a lot of people aren't doing. And so you can't take it for granted that just, well, we've got a lot of things that are going on and things are happening here and so forth. You can't assume it's just going to always stay that way, because the natural progression is to have less and less of that. And the very health of your community depends on the high engagement. So this is one of the things I talk about I talk about a number of these things in my book, but then I talk about so how do you find a third place? And you find people that are interested in the things that you're interested in, and you go meet them where they're meeting. You really pay attention to the places that are available in your community, and you make sure that they stay open, they stay viable. A lot of third places are struggling right now because you have some of them that are publicly funded, places like libraries and parks, but you have other cafes and bookstores and things like that need support from people, and so people have to be going there to support them if you want them to stay alive in your community. And then creating them is you create them by making sure that whatever place you have is conducive for conversation, that they're accessible, that they're easy to go to, and so forth. So I've talked about 45 minutes now, so I want to open it up to questions. And did you want to get that last? There you go. Go ahead. Get that, and I can give you that slide, or I can give you the graph. I've got some copies of the graphic too. So, any questions? Yes, please.
How do you acquire your information to form your data on how social they are in the rural?
Okay. Yes. So this is really interesting. The Social Capital Atlas is a research project that's headed by somebody named Raj Chetty, and he's got a team of researchers, and he published this. I think for the first time they went public about 2 years ago. And so you can just Google that, the Social Capital Atlas, and it's got every county in the United States, and you can do searches by county. So you can see the nationwide map that kind of shows you like different colors where people are, what counties are like as far as social capital. But then you can dive into these things like economic connectedness and cohesiveness and clustering, and they have all these terms that they talk about the ways in which people interact.
Is it through surveys, or is it like numbers of people that frequent the library?
Okay, so that's what so that's a great question, because prior to this project, pretty much all the social capital research was surveys. And Robert Putnam used both surveys, but then he also found some interesting data. He would find things like there's something, I think it's like the national Ketchup Institute or something like that. They're like was interested in, ketchup producers were interested in how often people went on picnics because that determined. And so they did all these surveys historically on people attending picnics, and he could go back and look and see like, we have fewer picnics every single decade from 1950 to 2000, people just aren't doing that as much. So that historically has been the kind of data. Raj Chetty is looking at social media. And social media gives them access to millions of data points. Now, it turns out it's not a perfect substitute for social capital, but there's a really strong correlation between these factors like the economic connectedness and the amount of trust in communities. And so, and then when you look at things like friending bias, you can find really interesting data at what is the rate at which people accept new friends when there's friend requests and things like that. So that's how they're looking at things like friending bias.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So in this one, you have comparative stuff based on income, and then you show Vernon County versus Crosse County, and there's a difference there. Is there anything relating connectedness because of population density?
Yeah.
Small towns, people are friendlier. Big
Yeah.
cities, get out of my way, you don't even make eye contact with anybody you walk.
Yeah. So if you look at Milwaukee, you will find a real dark blue kind of in the western, more suburban part where it's a little wealthier. You go right against the lake there, you get the orangish red.
Mm-hmm.
That's really, really low social capital there.
Mm-hmm.
So it's partly urban, but a lot of it has to do with poverty. So
Menominee
County,
Yeah.
right? That's a reservation. So that's not high density, but it's high poverty,
Mm-hmm.
right? So really low social capital. You find the same thing like the Pine Ridge Reservation, South Dakota. South Dakota has pretty high social capital, except for Pine Ridge. That's really low. And there's no economic connectedness because nobody has friends who are high income in that whole area. But then you also find high crime and other factors. Now, it's interesting when we look at cities, there's huge differences also in cities just depending on like neighborhood amenities. So there are areas of New York which will be kind of old neighborhoods which have all kinds of third places that are grandfathered into those neighborhoods. So they have delis and coffee shops and cafes, and they have a lot of places to go that are very accessible within walking distance. So even an area that isn't very wealthy will have really high rates of social capital and really low friending bias because there's so many gathering places within walking distance, people get to know one another. But you can go a few blocks away where it's new projects and high rises where they've torn down the old neighborhoods and built new ones without those places. And it's higher crime and really high friending bias. So that's why I've been focused so much on the third place phenomenon. And you can even look at it in towns around Wisconsin, where you can find, there's towns where you can drive through the town and you can see a lot of places to stop and gather, and you see people walking around and interacting with one another. And you can go through other towns of a similar population that look like ghost towns, because there's no social interaction there in the town. And so there is a correlation with the population density, but not as much as you'd think. Yeah. Yes?
Are you familiar with the From Project in UK, England?
The From?
The From Project. So social isolation has been
Yeah.
an area that I've been studying for about 10 years. And I kind of fell upon information about the From Project. So basically, a doctor at the hospital in England recognized that social isolation was causing chronic illnesses.
Yep.
And that doctor had the wherewithal to realize that she had something to do, that she could do something about it. So they created a connector in the hospital that she worked at for people who had high indications of social isolation. And that connector would find out what that individual needed, whether it was like a not-for-profit club or a church. And the rate of chronic illnesses dropped drastically.
considerably, yeah.
And so I've been studying that for a long time, and I now own a third place in Soldiers Grove.
You do, what is it?
Yep, I have the Old Oak Inn.
Oh.
And we have
The Old Oak Inn.
the Old
Yeah.
Oak Inn and Soldiers Grove.
It's my third place.
Fantastic,
Definitely.
yeah.
And I'm really, really happy to be instrumental in that in our area.
Well, that's interesting, because I've heard it mentioned, but I haven't heard it explained, and I haven't looked into that project. But, I mean, it's because of studies like that a lot of healthcare systems now are asking questions about social connection and
I
isolation,
know
right?
Anderson does.
Yep.
Good.
There's all, it's so interesting when we look at these public health studies, like so many things are coming out. Just last year, there was a fascinating study of dementia worldwide that was a meta-analysis. And it came out in the journal Nature Aging, looking at all the studies that have been done on dementia along with studies on social connection, have found that like a robust social connection reduces rates of dementia by 30 to 50%. Well, that's huge, right? And I was really surprised that this study comes out, and like if Lilly had come out with a new medication that lowered dementia rates by 30, 50%, they would be on all the news media everywhere. This just dropped like a lead balloon. It was just like where does that, what? Oh yeah, because you have to go out and make friends or start a third place. That will cure people. Isn't that great? So,
Could you just say the name of that project you mentioned?
the Frome Project,
Spell it.
Frome, Frome project.
Yeah, it was remarkable.
Putnam's work on social capital and social connection, one of the things that he found is that joining a club, if you don't belong to anything, joining one club reduces your chance of dying in the next year by 50%.
Jeez.
Lions is a great one.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, so, yes.
I just want to make a comment because we are new to the area. We just moved here a few months ago. And I lived in our prior property for 15, I was from that area for a long time, Northwest Indiana. But I lived in my prior residence for 15 years. And I knew neighbors from walking the neighborhood, but to know them by first name basis, I'm embarrassed to tell you, it's probably a handful. We were here the very first day we moved in. Neighbors on both sides came and said hi, let us know if we could do
So
anything.
annoying, aren't they? You have to put up fences
But
and,
I know so
yeah.
many people, I said, this is what I wanted, is community.
Yes.
And I had a daughter, my daughter lives here, and she's been here for 8 years, so we've been exposed to this, and we knew once he retired, because he worked in the steel mills, that we wanted to move out of the area, and we just saw this as an area that we could build connections.
Yeah.
Just
You
don't tell
know?
anybody.
I understand that, but good luck, you know? I mean-
But let me tell you what, which is fantastic, this is a great community, but
I have friends who, yeah.
Look at us now, we're going to Crosse today with friends.
see, there you go, you already got friends.
Yeah, we already made friends that, so, I mean, it's just, but it's not for everybody. I
Yeah.
mean, definitely, because we were where we could go to any restaurant, any business within 5 to 10 minutes. But you didn't have the connections because people could live independently and get what they needed.
Yeah,
We loved our gym. That's the one thing we really, really missed because we built a big connection with we were in a really large gym.
so there's another third place you can
Well,
go
and
to.
I'm just looking at picture with people who are, have commonalities and,
Yeah.
So,
So the-
other than that, we are, yeah.
Fastest growing sport in the US right now is pickleball,
Pickleball.
Yeah.
and largely because it's so social,
Yeah.
right? Which is amazing. So those are, there's some bright spots. I'm really encouraged by things like there's A lot of cities are changing their zoning laws to allow the development of things like coffee shops and bookstores and so forth in neighborhoods. The problem is a lot of neighborhoods don't want them there, neighbors don't want them there, so it's not having that big effect of change. Here's what really worries me. I was talking about this with a colleague on my campus. All fall this year, we have a quad that used to be really busy. We'd have beautiful days in the fall. There'd be students out there, and you'd walk across campus, and they'd be interacting and so forth.
Sure.
It's been empty
Whoa.
all fall. And I've been talking to colleagues around the country. This is the college students we have right now is a generation that was in high school during the pandemic. They're also that generation that's been affected really with high rates of social anxiety. They go to class and they go back to their room.
Ouch.
And we've got to think of things to do like that really invite them into activity and encourage them to interact. But we have to teach them how to interact with one another. It's a generation that has lost the knowledge of how to interact, how to go up and introduce themselves to somebody. And so we have to do this intentionally. We can't just say, okay, we're going to have a coffee shop here and people are going to come to it. That's not the case anymore. We have to teach people how to engage in social interaction. The Spokane Police Department started a program to train their new recruits on how to read facial expressions. Because they couldn't tell whether somebody was angry or afraid.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
how can we, you're preaching to the choir here.
Yep.
So how can we help future generations? I mean, if we have grandchildren, children, great-grandchildren, how can we help them?
First of all, schools have to ban cell phones and ban it completely from the school. And don't leave it up to teachers to make teachers the bad guys. And it's most important to ban it between classes and during lunchtime.
Yeah.
So we have only one state has instituted such a ban, and some schools are trying this. Most schools, like 80% of schools say they have cell phone restrictions, but what it turns out is they leave it up to the teachers, and the teachers quit enforcing it because it becomes so hard. And so that's first of all, because this is where young people learn social skills at social interaction by interacting with one another, and that's the place where they do it. So you have to start there, and then you introduce other kinds of activities and clubs, and you make sure if you have kids or grandkids, you make sure that they get involved in things. Make sure that they join something. I've been working with the Onalaska School District. They're making belonging the theme of the school, right? Making sure that every kid belongs to something and has a circle of friends.
All right.
So I think those kinds of initiatives, community-wide, but then then just like paying attention in your neighborhoods and things and encouraging activities. I think even things like you need a multiplicity of little things. So I had one of the graduates from our servant leadership program. We were talking about third places, and she realized, she said she was pregnant and she didn't know her neighbors. I thought, okay, what can I do about that? So she started a neighborhood block party. She lives in Milwaukee. And now she's been doing this for 6 years. And so her little kids know their neighbors.
All right.
Right? That sort of thing. Because once, the neighborhood block party just introduces, but then when they know them, then it's much easier to, they go out for a walk and they end up interacting, they end up in somebody's yard or going to somebody's house for cookies or something. You see how that just expands. So you just think of what are all these opportunities we have for introducing kids to different people? Thank you. Great question. Yes.
With all the statistics of the anxiety and the depressive diagnoses increasing so heavily, what is happening in our mental health world? I mean, are we, I have a feeling we're losing students that don't want to participate or to further education in a psychiatric
Yeah,
job.
Okay, will do.
yeah.
Do you see what the...
Yeah, you know, it's really hard when we're seeing people withdraw, and, you know, a lot of times you don't really know why do people drop out of things. You know, we've seen a huge drop in enrollment in colleges nationwide. And then, like this, especially young men. So one of the reasons we see the real difference between girls and boys is they report differently, right? What we're seeing with boys and young men is like this real increase of unemployment. And in some communities, like around a 40%, this is many rural communities, around a 40% rate of reporting disability. And so, so you have from those kinds of statistics an indication that a lot of this seems to be mental health, right? So, so I think we're at kind of a crisis stage, and I think it has to be done community by community. We try to do so many things politically and through legislation, but this is a cultural issue. This isn't a political issue. And cultural issues need to be corrected culturally.
Yeah.
That's things that we do neighbor to neighbor. Yeah. So, thank you very much. We're at the end of our time. Great to talk to you.